I mean by borrowing from the postmodern playbook is that it's going to exalt, above all else, individualism and independence, right? And that yields certain deductive conclusions that you can't escape, right? And so even though you'll hear me mention postmodernism over the next several minutes, you're also going to hear a direct correlation and connection between postmodernism and the resulting conclusions and societal implications of that, and personal implications of that. And it's exactly the same for Satanism because they're borrowing from the same principles. And so the principles work, whether you call it postmodernism or Satanism, modern Satanism, they're going to work exactly the same way. And so this is what it is. Because there is no objective God, then the Satanist asserts, God is the projection of the internal self of any individual person. So God is whoever you see God to be. It is a projection of your inner consciousness, your inner self. And from that, your entire reality is formed, right? Obviously not ontologically, but in the sense of perceptively, right? That's the assertion. And this is, the same postmodern ideology, of there is no objective reality because reality is just a conglomerate of our subjective experiences. There is no objective truth. There is no objective authority or absolute truth. There is nothing, so the postmodern and the atheist, or not the atheist, sorry, the postmodern and the Satanist would assert, there is nothing that is absolutely 100% true everywhere for everyone at all times. Everything is subjective, everything is fluid, and it's based on, the individual. So what's good for me may not be good for you. What's right for me might not be right for you. What's true for me might not be true for you. And it's not a matter of relativity. Well, it is a matter of relativity, but it's not in the sense of, this isn't good for me because, this doesn't work for my situation. No, it's saying it's morally wrong for me, but it's morally inherently right for you because that morality is not based on any objective standard of right and wrong, but based on how you feel about what's right and wrong and how I feel about what's right and wrong. And so it's okay for us to disagree. As a matter of fact, postmodernism and Satanism is going to celebrate pluralistic views, right? The diverse perceptions, as long as they're not really theistic. And what I mean by that is, so back to what I said before in the previous video, these groups are going to fundamentally distinguish themselves, not just fundamentally, but vehemently distinguish themselves from those theistic, what they would call devil worshipers, right? They would say that there are some small, insignificant remnant group, fringe group in the outskirts of their, nomenclature, their little section of society that actually theistically worship Satan in place of the Abrahamic God. And they would say those people are illogical and irrational, and they would vehemently distinguish themselves from that because Satanists in the modern sense are going to classify themselves basically as atheists or agnostics, right? They're going to say, hey, this is a satirical and philosophical rejection and opposition to, like I said, A, the monotheistic Abrahamic religions, and B, those things or those societal norms and containments would seek to prohibit human expression, right? Sexually and socially and interpersonally and materially. And again, you won't find, at least not in any of the more intellectual spheres, a Satanist promoting sociologically or promoting pragmatically hedonism, because that doesn't work. That just straight up doesn't work in any society. Even though that's the logical deduction of what they're asserting, right? They're not going to promote it. They're not going to promote pleasure. For those who don't know what hedonism is, pleasure above all else, right? They're not going to promote that. But that does end up being the logical conclusion when you exalt above, over, and against anything else the conceptualization of the self. When you deify the self, and they wouldn't say that, again, ontologically, they wouldn't say, oh, you are a God. But what they would say in essence is symbolically, you are your own God. You determine truth. You determine your reality. You determine those different things. And so it's a exaltation, a promotion of the self. And we see a lot of that in our society, right? We see a lot of that in our postmodern age of do what you want to do, and it's all about me, myself, and I, and those kind of things, and live in your truth. Speak your truth. That's true for you. And your truth is your truth, and nobody can argue against your truth. You're living in your truth. That's your reality, etc., etc. All of those ideologies are postmodern in nature, right? They're not rational at all. And I could get more into that later, but the point is that sort of ideology is going to eventually lead to, and when I say eventually, I mean inevitably, it's going to lead to a degradation of society, right? So, for starters, my first point of disagreement, it directly opposes everything that the Christian worldview represents, right? The Christian worldview promotes community and selflessness over and against the individual, right? It's all about the community of believers, not the one individual. As a matter of fact, there are scriptures which starkly and explicitly discourage that sort of individualistic and independent sort of rendering of a worldview and rendering of your faith, right? They'll say things like, scripture says things like, all scripture is God-breathed and profitable for doctrine, and no scripture is open to private interpretation, right? And what that means is you don't get to just decide yourself what this scripture means and assert that as the dominant meaning. No. There is an objective meaning in scripture. So there's no inherent or individual or subjective interpretation in scripture. All scripture is objective because it comes from an objective source, a truly transcendent source, right? So all of these fundamental principles within Satanism of the projection of self as sort of the arbiter of morality, the arbiter of truth, the arbiter of good, Christianity is going to vehemently reject that. Right? I've said vehemently like 3 times in this video, but it's going to explicitly reject that, right? But even philosophically, this is why I disagree with it. And once again, this is why I say I don't see really any distinctions. Organizationally, the Church of Satan is going to say we're not the Satanic Temple, and the Satanic Temple is going to say we're not Luciferians. But they all assert the same thing. They assert those postmodern principles. They assert that they are getting their symbology of Satan from art and from literature and sort of what he represents. He represents sort of enlightenment, and as the light bringer, he's a seeker of truth. Excuse me. He's going to be pushing for the expression of self, and he's going to rebel against those expectations, those societal norms, and for sure these impositions by the monotheistic Abrahamic religions. And so satirically and symbolically, they lean into that rebel nature, that enlightened nature of Satan or Lucifer, the Prometheus, the Pluto, or the Venus, those people who are seeking sort of higher sense of self-awareness and establishing themselves independently from their surrounding environment as their own arbiter of truth. They're looking at that in culture, in architecture, in art, in literature, and they're pulling on that, right? And so the nomenclature and the terminology Satanist is not that they are deifying Satan. And I kind of disagree with that. I also disagree with, the assertion that, the people who do actually theistically worship Satan or Lucifer are going to be some small fringe group. I think it's a lot more than they're willing to admit and a lot more than we would necessarily understand. But that's also a different conversation. I'm going to fundamentally disagree with it because society can't work that way. Because the logical deduction of that frame of thinking and that framework, that systematic interlocking of ideas is going to be total anarchy. The reason we see a intense increase in depression and manic depression and all of these different psychological and mental issues, the reason I think fundamentally we see a major increase in suicide rates, not just in adults, but in teens, in groups that we've never seen increases in suicide in, is because people are feeling like an island surrounded by people. right? People are feeling isolated in the crowd because all of these things that are pushed in our societies that are meant to be these exaltations and evolutions of the self, they alienate and they deconstruct interpersonal relationships, which is how humans function in community, in society. No one can function on their own, and that's what causes a lot of these issues. That's why I disagree with it.